So we are now recording to the cloud.
Okay.
So we are back recording and live, and this is our Land Use and Development Committee meeting. So welcome this morning, and we will go ahead and get started. And I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. Remember, this morning we are going to, you all had some homework to do, looking at some of the links. Ken added some things, some links in there last night. And I'm going to turn it over to Shannon to give us an overview and get us started. First, though, are there updates or any information items that we need to discuss before we get rolling into our discussion of purpose-built student housing regulations?
Not as pertains to purpose-built student housing. The only updates I have are we have not yet located the Kennesaw ordinances. We are still working on that. So we have the ones that I posted last week from Orem, Utah. If you guys think it's helpful, I can pull those up and share my screen and talk through those. And then also take a look at that links page I sent out. Ken posted a lot of helpful links from Chapel Hill. And I've been starting to go through their ordinance this morning to see if there's anything we can pull out and use from that. So.
And Ken also posted a link. I have not seen it. Shannon showed these to us late last night. Ken posted a link that looked at the idea in Chapel Hill of a housing, a housing commission as well that we may discuss. And then when we get through this discussion, if we have time, again, to give you just a brief update, we did delay the vote on strategic planning ordinance 1 the other night until our next meeting. And in the interest of that, I would like our next discussion to be some of the things that we've been talking about and David has been discussing is, maybe we get to a point of a little more clarity just about the new development process, how things are done. As well. So I think that'll be our next point of discussion after the purpose-built student housing homework that we had everyone do this week. So with that, yeah, Shannon, if you could pull that link up to probably the Orem, Utah regulations were the ones that did the best job of outlining those things. And if you could put those on the screen, that would be great. And then want to start with general comments and thoughts that people had after taking a look at those. Or we think these are great and we think we should use this as our base and our baseline to go on if we are going to go down this road. All right, great. That was easy. Elaine has her hand up.
I do like the idea of having as an overlay, and I think we should consider that as opposed to having a totally separate zoning ordinance.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I see it, as just an added layer to the zoning.
So what happens when purpose-built student housing doesn't occur in an overlay district? I mean, that's, I guess the question I have is, do we want to be in the position of actually designating where we think purpose-built student housing should be in the city and where it should not be? And that was my thought about zoning districts for purpose-built student housing. So I guess the question I have is when purpose-built student housing is proposed in something outside of an overlay district, is it possible to build it?
That was my initial thought, is that if we have this, if it does, anytime purpose-built student housing is proposed, we can say, all right, we have to consider where it's going, if it's not already in an area like an overlay area or a catalyst area where we have said student housing may be appropriate, that, that might be decision level one. Well, no, that's not one of the districts where it's appropriate, but you should still consider it, given future circumstances, is that, have circumstances changed. And you would still have these regulations that anytime and anywhere that someone proposes student housing, that they have to follow this list of regulations. Is that what you're saying, David?
Well, yeah, and I guess Todd has his hand up and maybe he has the answers for this question. But my point is, if someone goes into a multifamily housing zoning area and proposes purpose-built student housing and it doesn't have an overlay on it, can they just build? My point would be is at the very least to exclude purpose-built student housing from multifamily housing zoning definitions, and that it has a unique and distinct definition because it is a unique and distinct housing type.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. So you wouldn't require this in current RM3, RM4 districts where student housing certainly has been built, like in the old Calhoun area, and you can get, the 56 bed per acre density level there, and that is definitely marketed, built for students. That these wouldn't apply in those residential zoning areas, but this would be its own new classification,
right,
for student
but Todd
housing.
has his hand.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that there are a couple of ways that you could accomplish this. One of the things that we had talked about in the development of the white paper was that if we create the zones where, like in the Orem ordinance, where they're allowing 7 stories and higher density, and like Bob alluded to, that we continue to tamp down density elsewhere, that you drive the purpose-built student housing where you want it, and that those districts where you have the higher density is where you put your student occupancy requirement, if we can make that part work, because that's the student occupancy requirement is about the only thing in here that's really different than our ordinance now, or that's other than defining, they created an overlay zone where the student occupancy requirement is required. And I think that's equivalent to where we're going with the catalyst areas, if I'm correct. So the question then becomes, if, like where Bob was talking about north of the tracks back there off of Creekside and Charleston Avenue, if somebody wanted to build a quadplex building where there were 4 bedrooms that's focused around a living room, that the question is whether or not we would allow that one building to be built. And David, if you're saying that you don't allow that anywhere except for the catalyst zones, regardless of the density, then that becomes, that'll be a bit of a challenge, because then that gets into determining how every structure is built. The reason I raised my hand was as an alternative, that you make it attractive and you draw the purpose-built student housing where you want it, by providing the densities and putting in the protections that y'all have talked about, to say, we'll give you this extra density, but you're going to have to, this is going to be where the students go, and you're going to have to prove that to us on an annual basis. So that was just another way of looking at it.
Well, I guess my concern is incentives are good, and I'm all for those, but the minute you put high density purpose-built student housing in any residential neighborhood, you've basically challenged it, and I think if we're trying to create other forms of multifamily housing that are affordable for other populations, and you don't somehow control for purpose-built student housing going into those particular places where we're trying to encourage that, then we're creating student slums. I mean, it's not going to be a desirable place for other people to live. And so again, it's the notion of mixed populations, mixed uses, and things like that. That's where my concern lies, is that you can provide incentives to develop in certain places, but if you don't put barriers to development in other sensitive places, then I think you're still going to get that. People are going to go where the land prices are least expensive, the ability to acquire property is easiest, and so that's the challenge, in my opinion. That's why I think it should be a completely separate and distinct zoning classification, and we should clearly determine where those should be.
Okay. Ken, and then Christine.
Thanks. In addition to looking at the information on the student housing overlay, they have an affordable housing overlay in Orem. I also looked at the zoning ordinance for high density apartments, and they have an item H there, mitigation, that speaks specifically about negative economic and aesthetic impacts the proposed development may have on the surrounding neighborhood. I would suggest that if we included something like that, that we would also include social and cultural impacts as well as the other impacts mentioned. Yeah. But I do think that that's going to be important. I mean, I agree with David's comments on that.
Yeah. Yeah, Ken, I saw that too. You're talking about the high-rise overlay.
Right.
Yeah, that they have. And
Yes.
yeah, they had, I read through a bunch of their stuff. There were a lot of other components in there that I think we could take a look at. So,
Yes.
I mean, Chris.
Yeah, back to David's point, and this is a question for Todd, in response to how to solve the problem of protection of these neighborhoods. Cadillac Heights, for example, would what you're proposing, would that offer protection to Cadillac Heights?
No, that what I was proposing was providing incentives to where to David's point, that what I was suggesting was directing or attracting the student housing where you want it. The housing that has been proposed over at Cadillac Heights is not purpose-built student housing. Those are single-family homes. There are properties over there that are more traditional single-family homes, and they're not all being rented to students, and they're not all being rented. And so, but that zoning district does not allow anything but single-family homes.
Okay.
And so, well, I take that back. It allows duplexes also. It does allow duplexes.
Okay, so there is some protection there.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, the underlying zoning is the density is capped over there at a much lower rate to make it less attractive for student housing. However, that said, that if you look at, I think it's called the Varsity, the apartment complex that was, not apartment, but the patio home development that was kind of across the street from Summey, from the old Bilo, that is predominantly student housing. They're single family homes, but it's predominantly student housing. There are not, I think there's I know several non-students living over there, but, and so that's a tricky one because that's not purpose-built student housing. That's traditional single family homes. And but then the property owner has chosen to allow them to rent to, I don't know if those are rented by the unit or by the bed or not, but anyway.
Hey, Todd, Todd,
Yeah.
just a quick question. When that property owner and developer bought that property, did they go to the city and ask for a zoning change, or did that fit within the current zoning?
It was all, there was no zoning change required.
Okay. Okay.
And that's, you know, that's one of the challenges to a lot of our
Right.
historically Black neighborhoods is they are zoned in a manner which allows for patio homes and allows for duplexes.
Yeah. So that's like, that is like the poster child for the fear that people have of, like, someone comes in, they develop, you know, particularly in RM1 or whatever that zoning classification is, neighborhoods, they buy those homes, they push people out, and even though they're single family homes that are being developed, that they're at a price point or they're attractive to students rather than families. So, you know, that community change. So hands that were up, we had David, then Elaine's hand was up, but she put it down. David?
Well, I mean, that is a separate issue in my mind that needs different kinds of controls, because we're having invasion of student housing in almost all neighborhoods in Clemson, right? And those houses tend to be less maintained, deteriorating, and people are buying them up for cash, right? So that we have to tackle that one separately. And part of that, in my opinion, is much stricter enforcement of the rental housing thing, because, you know, I just think that, you know, we should have some standards for when properties are rental, and we do, but we should have definitely much stricter enforcement in terms of the number of occupants, in terms of the number of cars, in terms of, you know, because the reason I think it's a different problem is because those properties are not in perpetuity necessarily going to be student housing. They're not designed to be, they're designed as single family residential occupancies and can always be converted back to it. But the problem with purpose-built, high density purpose-built student housing is it will never be anything other than that, right? So I think we have to tackle these two problems separately, and they are sticky problems for sure, this one.
Yeah, and so David, I was going to suggest, and I don't know if this is the right way to go, but the non-student housing neighborhood protection and preservation and planning group that Elaine and Catherine are leading. I wonder if it might be best, or if they are talking, and Elaine's got her hand up next, if you all are talking about those kind of issues in that committee as well. So Elaine?
We are, that's what I wanted to mention. We are
Okay.
having discussions about adding overlays to add protection to those, specifically the historically underserved populations, the primarily African-American communities. Cadillac Heights, Vista Circle, well, although Vista Circle's an RM12, it's a little more protected, but Red Hill and Abel and those are either RM1 or RM2. So if we put an overlay on there, that might help with what we're talking about with them. And if you have suggestions for how that should look, this committee would greatly appreciate them.
Okay, and then are y'all also talking a little bit about the rental housing ordinance and rental housing regulations at all? Okay.
A little bit, but I think one of the things we have mentioned, and I think we probably need to pursue, is that we somehow established a housing or a bed inventory system, whether it's through the rental housing program or something, so we can get a better handle on the number of beds and who's occupying them. I noticed in this overlay for Orem, there was something about the it was the one you had, scroll down a little bit, I think. It was the one that had the occupancy requirement. At the end, see, it talks about the owner or manager retaining documents, establishing student status for each dwelling unit for a period of 2 years and make them available to the city. I like that idea, or somehow having, so we can somehow have an inventory, a true inventory, accurate inventory of the beds and who's occupying them.
Right. Okay, other thoughts on the, so we're, that's where we need to have some crosstalk between the land use committee and the housing committee as we're moving forward with those, particularly in the area of this other issue of how we do address our historic neighborhoods and the rental housing ordinance. We need to be talking with each other there in those two committees. So purpose-built student housing, back to David's point, separate. I tend to agree with David, for the record, that a separate zoning category and separate group of regulations that we use, that we refer to with the if we have catalyst areas or overlay districts where we want to push that, we say in this area, if and when student housing is allowed, that, you refer to the purpose-built student housing zoning ordinance to see those regulations in that section. Other thoughts or comments there? Elaine, is your hand up a holdover? Yeah. So David.
Well, I mean, at the very least, then we exclude purpose-built student housing from those other multifamily housing things and require that they be developed as a PD. I mean, if we don't create if we rely on an overlay district to regulate purpose-built student housing, then in my mind, the in-between solution is if not to create another zoning classification, then to at least exclude purpose-built student housing from multifamily housing zoning definitions, and therefore require that they be pursued as a PD with the extra regulatory and oversight conditions that come with that. But
Okay.
that would be a kind of middle ground solution, I guess, if it's possible.
Okay.
Mhm.
On first, 10 seconds of thought, I like that. I like that idea.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts there?
I would agree with that idea as well. I think that offers protection for the multifamily areas.
Mhm.
Any other things when you looked at these regulations, any other things like Ken was pointing out from some of the other areas that we might want to include if we think about proposing a purpose-built student housing zoning classification?
Mhm.
I thought it was interesting in the area where it discussed the square footage of the bedrooms. 100 square feet was designated for one person, but if it went over 100 square feet, perhaps 2 students could occupy that room. Is that a loophole for a developer, or does it offer more protection in the wording of that? So
But I
question
think they still had it. They still had an occupancy per unit, not per bedroom, right? So whether there were 2 people living in a bedroom or 1 person, you still only could have like a maximum of 4 per unit, depending on that size. Did I read that right, or am I?
It was still per unit. Yes.
Occupancy is per unit. So even if if a developer decided to make a 12 by 14 bedroom and 2 people could be in there, the occupancy was set per unit, not per bedroom.
Okay.
So again,
that still
yeah,
does provide some protection for the number of the density of that. Okay.
right. It should. Yes. Tom?
Yeah, I saw that bedroom dimension too, and most student housing bedrooms are being built bigger than that now for one occupant. You know, typically you have a queen, and just the way it's arranged, usually with a study desk, it's a little bit bigger than that. But if there's an occupancy limit based on the unit, then that's fine. Back to what David was saying earlier, I just want to make sure I understand. So if there is an existing zoning ordinance of R4 that allows 56 beds per acre, and a developer wanted to come in and tear down whatever's there that's old and build back, would he or she go through the ordinance as it's written now, or would it have to become a PD based on what we just talked about? Just some clarity there.
Well, I mean, my idea is that we distinguish purpose-built student housing from regular multifamily housing, because it is structurally and fundamentally distinct housing type that is not desirable for any other kind of occupancy. And so therefore, I mean, again, I would support a separate zoning classification for it, but if that's not what we decide to do, then I think we should exclude purpose-built student housing from, let's say, an R4 or any other multifamily occupant zoning district, with the exception that they submit as a PD. I mean, the point of this is to control where purpose-built student housing is, right? So, and particularly high-density purpose-built student housing. That would be my point. Now, again, I don't know what's the best mode, whether to have a separate zoning classification or this compromise kind of half solution, I guess. But yeah, I would think we would want to ensure that someone couldn't go into an R4 zoning district without review and just build a purpose-built student housing complex in it.
Even at the currently allowed 56 beds per acre.
Yeah, I mean, because again, it's not about. I firmly believe the density is being gamed, and B, it fundamentally creates in perpetuity a different kind of neighborhood, right? It's a fundamentally different neighborhood than that will never be anything else. That's, to me, it's a structural problem. Does that make sense?
I understand. I was just curious because, you know, you will get that. You'll have some people, let's say at at a complex that's been rented to students for 40 or 50 years, and they're going to get ready to, knock everything down and build new with student housing. And what you're saying is, all right, you got to go through a PD process, and that's fine. That's just what I was curious about. And that makes sense. It's a matter for some people. They're going to say, well, geez, I've got 56 beds an acre. Are you going to reduce me now to 24 or 36? That's when I think you get into sticky legal matters that, I can't really talk about, but yeah, I hear what you're saying. That makes sense to me.
Now, I think we do have to be careful about unintended consequences, because what we don't want people to do is just sit on deteriorating properties because they can't rebuild, right? So that is something to consider for sure.
And I think a lot of what you're going to see, for example, if there's a magic wand tomorrow and there's no other areas student housing can be built other than what's existing, I can see a lot of the older stock of housing that's been around, from 40 or 50 years, even 25 years, where people will come in and they will repurpose that area. There's no R4 left in town really to develop, but there's a good bit of older stock that's ready for something. Now, whether that's preserved as affordable housing or if it becomes student, that's the next step, because people are, the developers look for any opportunity like that to assemble. And the first thing they're going to look for is something that's old and looks run down. That's pretty much what's been developed in Clemson really over the last 20 years. if you went back and looked at an aerial or looked at street view of a lot of the areas of what Clemson looked like 20, 25 years ago, you wouldn't believe it, the change. And I think that's where, that's going to happen in a big way in the next 10 years. So I agree. You have to have some kind of a plan, or you're going to get exactly, it's either going to be something good or something bad. So,
Bob, and David, that, understanding more clearly what, the form this is going to take, that I think one of the critical challenges is going to be coming up with the definition of the physical construct of what do we consider student-built housing, and more importantly, what we consider to not be purpose-built student housing. One of the definitions that we had provided y'all for the student housing was that each bedroom must have a bathroom that's only accessible by the bedroom, and that no bath is accessible except via a bedroom. So there's no like powder room, if you will, and that all bedrooms open to the same common area, and that there are limits on storage and stuff. The kind of dormitory style housing that is generally being built in these high-rise areas. I think it might be easier to come up with a language for the purpose-built student housing where we might need to put a little extra thought to is, okay, we say that we don't allow that in RM3 off of Charleston Avenue and Creekside. What do we allow? I mean, we would that would mean that you would have to have a house where you have at least one bedroom that doesn't have its own bathroom. And because then that would no longer be, because if every bedroom has its own bathroom, it kind of lends itself to student housing. And so the language that for the Clemson Triangle, for example, where we were trying to look at workforce housing in that catalyst zone, that one of the things that we said was that it would be, they would have increased storage. They would have at least one bedroom that did not have an attached bath, and things such as that, like a larger utility room, the kind of things that would lend itself to a family. Now, this would not prevent an owner from renting that out to students, but to David's point, it would make it more likely that down the road, a family could live in there in a more functional manner. So I think what a lot of this is going to come down to, in addition to the decision as to where we want the purpose of the student housing and where we want to dissuade it, will be the actual definitions of what the interior functionality of those structures will be like, because that is probably going to be the determining factor. And in looking at some of these ordinances that there wasn't a lot of information in there. The one on Orem, does talk about the 100 square foot bedrooms, but that related more to how they gauge density. Anyway, I just wanted to put that out there because we can, if you've got a 3-bedroom, 2-bath unit with whether it's an apartment or a freestanding house, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a big utility laundry room, that could be attractive to a family. I don't know the mechanism we would have to say that a person couldn't rent it to students and just tell one of the students, you're not going to have your own bath, you're sharing it, or whatever. Unless we add an additional layer to say, we're not going to allow you to rent to students. And that starts to get into a little bit of slippery territory from a legal standpoint as to determining what class of people can live there. Anyway, I
think that's true. I mean, the issue that's in regulating how they're rented, so individual student leases versus leasing for a house. I don't think we have any ability to really regulate whether someone rents a normal residential domicile to either students or not, other outside of the student rental or the rental housing program, right? The occupancy regulations in terms of unrelated occupants. I think we can add language about individual leases or sublets, and things like that. But getting back to Tom's thing, one of the things that I think we could do, I mean, if we have conceded that certain areas are existing student housing, not built, purpose built, but are housing apartment complexes, and one of the things we can do is make them either designate them for student housing in the zoning as a zoning classification or as an overlay for student housing to incentivize the replacement of those with higher quality, better housing options for students. If we've already conceded that those complexes are in a sense essentially student housing. But I think I agree, Todd. The tricky thing is going to be defining what classifies purpose-built student housing. And then I think we have to, in a companion way, really reinforce the rental housing program here in terms of how we specify it and how we regulate it and inspect it.
Right. My big question is, because as you say, David, it's about the form of the housing that, do we think that, and probably, I tend to think probably not, that, if we have a different form that we require or don't allow, the student focused type of form with 4 bedrooms opening onto a small common area, no storage, individual bathrooms, not accessible thing. Even if in our RM areas, we said, that's not, you've got to have this form of, storage, the things that would be more attractive to people other than students. I don't know, that's probably not going to slow down students renting those places. I mean, I think we've got examples of those types of units that have some storage and covered parking and all those kind of things that are fully rented by students as well. So I do tend to like the idea of zoning districts or overlays where we say student housing is appropriate in these areas, as opposed to if we only do the form-based stuff, and our intention is to have areas that are, multifamily housing that are more geared towards adults, working professionals, families. I don't know that simply the form is going to do that. Fran?
So just a clarification. So we're talking about overlays in addition to where the current catalyst areas are being proposed, or is whatever we decide on student housing going to be limited to the current to the proposed catalyst areas? How far out are we extending these overlays beyond the catalyst? I thought the intent with catalyst zones was to identify where the purpose-built student housing was going to be. Are we talking about expanding that now?
Not necessarily, Fran. I think so. And the catalyst areas cover most of what we would be talking about in one form or another. There might be some that if we did need to expand, we might need to think further out 93, where there's some purpose-built or not, the student housing that occurred, in the last 20 years, 25 years, out 93, we might need to think a little bit there. But otherwise, I think the catalyst areas do cover a little bit of both, where there might be the higher density purpose-built student housing stuff, and then like the near north, where we're talking about now, the old Calhoun area, that's in a catalyst area. So, but it could be different types and levels of allowable student housing or types of student housing that may be, depending on what that looks like, it could be appropriate for students, or it could be appropriate for families, working professionals and adults.
So yeah, so my preference would be that we limit it to catalyst areas and probably areas where the student housing already exists, but not expand it beyond that at all.
Yeah, like, so R12, R20 neighborhoods are off the table. Maybe some things that we might do to, and the housing group could, the non-student housing group could help with this, with like some of our RM1 zone neighborhoods that are historic neighborhoods, maybe some of our more vulnerable neighborhoods, that some things that we do there to make it way less attractive and way more difficult to assemble and change those in a significant way. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I think the more we restrict it, the more that we're going to have support from the community.
And David, the idea of things having to come as a plan development or forcing that, specifically, that has become in the background a legal question of whether we can require a PD or not. By not saying a PD is required, but really leaving that as the only option. You might not be able to explicitly state that, but you can create a situation where that's the only lane for something to happen.
That's why the specific zoning ordinance for purpose-built student housing may be the cleanest thing, but and then we have absolute control over where we want it to be.
Yeah, and there may be, and as you look at these things, as Ken mentioned, there are other zoning or zoning classifications that we can consider as well that might help us with some of these things outside, because a PD is pretty specific, but there's other ways that we can talk about, because the state law allows us to create other zoning designations as deemed necessary and appropriate, as long as our comp plan / white paper are driving that. So with that, Shannon had her hand up first, and then Fran.
I just wanted to see if y'all wanted to circle back and take a look at that purpose-built student housing definition that staff had started, and see if you wanted to add to that in any way or work on that today. Well, we had some time left, or if you wanted to continue your discussion about overlays versus zoning districts.
Yeah. So do we want to do that? Is there anything else? Ken gave us a few specifics, requirements there. Is there anything that you've read in this that you think we need to, throw out as a starting point, or are there other things, as Ken suggested earlier, that we need to put into this if we're going to use this as an initial framework and model for a purpose-built student housing zoning classification? And let me let Fran, whose hand was up, go first.
Just one other quick point. I think this is a great conversation, but I think we also have to keep in mind that there are many students, grad students, international students, who can't afford to live in the housing currently being built for students. And we have to, I guess, be cautious. Whatever changes, whatever we do, it still permits housing that's not going to be that expensive, that it's still going to be for students, because we have lots of students who can't afford what's being built right now, but who still need student housing, maybe more desperately than others. So I don't know if all these plans allow us to accommodate those groups, or we're going to drive the process that everything becomes so expensive that the students who desperately need housing for themselves and their families can't do that, including houses in neighborhoods, right? So I just think we have to keep in mind there's lots of diversity in terms of student needs, and we probably need to make sure there's equal diversity in terms of student opportunity for housing. And I don't know if what we're talking about makes that difficult or not, but we have to be, I think, aware of the danger of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, Fran, there's lots of faculty, staff, vice presidents, and athletic directors, and people that couldn't afford the high density luxury student housing rates if you rented the whole unit for your family, not just grad students and others. So
Very true, Bob. You're right.
Yeah.
But just,
Yeah.
just because, but there are many students who can't afford to live in those
Yeah.
places. And I'd hate old stock housing to disappear, or, little duplexes like near someone a couple weeks ago mentioned down here near the Tiger Bubble Bath and out 133 that really meet a need, a desperate need. We can't lose attention to that too.
All right. So back to specifics in the purpose-built student housing code from Orem. First, are we comfortable generally with this as a good starting point, framework, model to edit, add to, take away from? Any objections to that as using this as a starting point? Sorry, something almost fell off on my table here. All right, hearing no objections, we'll use this as a model. And then we can, as we find others and maybe, again, locate the Kennesaw ordinances, we can look at those. Ken has made some specific recommendations about things to consider. Ken, Shannon, did you get those earlier? And Ken, can you remind us again of those
Yes.
2 or 3 points?
I mentioned, let's see, impact fees. There was some mention in the Orem one in a different section regarding impact fees. They were specifically related to water, but I mean, impact fees are also associated with development. Also, I had a question regarding development set-asides. Again, these are things to think about in terms of incentivizing, mitigating certain types of development, especially in terms of how to encourage development of less lucrative housing options, such as affordable housing and workforce housing that we're talking about. In Clemson, we don't have a problem with lack of student housing, but it's the lack of the other less lucrative options. And so how do we incentivize that? Carrot or stick? I mean, in terms of, trying to make that happen in a place where it's sorely needed. So impact fees, development set-asides, and I also mentioned the mitigation with regard to considering negative economic and aesthetic impacts. I would also include social and cultural impacts as well. And I also mentioned in the chat that in the housing overlay for Orem, they also mentioned and required a traffic study. And we've been talking about the a regional traffic study. So with regard to student housing, that was a component of their decision-making process as well.
Gotcha. All right. Any other thoughts on that? Specific things to consider? For example, like their high rise, they had some, if they were going to allow the additional height, they had some additional requirements there, as far as it's a 50-foot setback from the front property line, for example, as opposed to, I think ours is considerably less than that now. It talks about, some other things there. So I think if you can look at those if you go to those overlay zones, they have high rise, student housing, infill overlay. First of all, in the student housing, it talks about on undeveloped land. We don't have a ton of that, right? So most of ours is going to be infill redevelopment as well. So obviously right off the bat, you got to change that language a little bit. The infill had some, their mixed use had some things that we might, need to consider that would be applicable to this specific idea of purpose-built student housing. So continue to do that. Tom, you had your hand up.
Yeah, the height is definitely, I mean, we lowered height in downtown from 65 feet to 50. And then the CM zone is actually 40 with another 10 feet if you increase buffers. So, you know, that 60-foot mark, and a lot of student developers, they'll do kind of a podium, they'll do concrete, and then they'll do 4 stories. And 5 stories is about what gets you 60 feet. But I'm sure Todd or David or Christine will tell you that there's ways to game that where you're, you know, part of it's a basement and you can actually get an extra half story. So, you know, height wise, that's a consideration. And then with what Ken was saying, I think, and I know I've mentioned this before, but, you know, collectively student housing is probably, you know, Clemson's industry, so to speak, in terms of, you know, the amount of tax revenue and everything else. And there's such a huge demand for people to come in that I think there's a real opportunity, as long as you can do it legally, to fund a lot of these things, like, you know, set asides for workforce or for lower income housing or protections, or, you know, more money for transit, all those type of things. And, you know, again, it's somewhat of a tax, but and I guess the you know, the students, while they're here for 4 years, they would pay a little bit higher fees to do that. And then you, as Fran said, you protect some of these older areas, you know, figure out a way where you may not create a lot more lower income or affordable housing, but you retain what you have. You don't allow what you certainly give an incentive to make it nice and better, but you know, you don't gentrify everything because you raise all these fees, and maybe you're only raising these fees on bigger projects. But I think, again, student housing collectively is kind of like, for all practical purposes, our BMW, just because of the sheer amount of money. And a lot of these developers would be willing to pay this and come in. They would be absolutely willing to. That's how badly they want to get in here. So I think it's an opportunity for us to help fund some of this stuff.
Yeah. So David's next, but yeah, I think we need to realize that, like, you know, again, we have people still chomping at the bit to go ahead and get started when lumber prices and labor and everything right now are adding, you know, 20 to 35% to the price of projects. That tells you a lot about how profitable these types of projects are, that people are still wanting to go ahead with projects when they know that the price is going to be significantly higher. David?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for, you know, I've been arguing for impact fees that are comparable to what the impact is on our community. And I think that these kinds of projects need to have significant impact fees. I think, you know, I go to other municipalities and set asides for income adjusted units in developments. I mean, I'd be much more for a higher density that would set aside units for, you know, moderate and low income occupancies, as opposed to height. You know, I mean, I think height and setbacks is a blunt instrument. It still doesn't mitigate the impact of a project on its surrounding neighborhood. And you can have some higher buildings that are better, have less impact than lower buildings. So, you know, to me, the height limit is just a blunt instrument, and certainly we don't want buildings with 50-foot setbacks, because then they're going to put parking lots in there. So, you know, I mean, I think that we put incentives, impact fees, we set asides for moderate and low income housing, you know, dedicated units, those kind of things, and that could even, you know, to me, the dedicated units for moderate to low income housing should not be in necessarily purpose-built student housing, but should be in other multifamily housing conditions, so that, again, you get a mix of residents of different backgrounds, of different income levels, of different things. I mean, that's what we want in this community, not these single use kind of high density districts of one type of occupancy.
Yeah. So, and David, that's getting into the other conversation that we're not going to really have time to get started into today, but that's the how we do things. And I think that's where we need to go, where we're talking, what are our character and form and, you know, those kind of things that we want to get right, that may make a taller building more attractive than, you know, a small, massive building that covers up the entire site, more attractive. So I think that's an important step that we need to get to is, again, how we do things, what we want to see as from that character and form standpoint. The impact fees are an important discussion, and I wanted to see Andy's still on here, I believe. Andy, impact fees. Can we have differential impact fees based on the type of development and the zoning classification?
I do not think you can. I think it has to be even across the board, but you can't. But we do have things where the fee is different based on the impact of the development. So if you have a whole bunch of units contributing, it's going to cost a lot more than another type of business. So we do take that into account.
Okay, and my second question there is, though, we probably need to look at our impact fees anyway that apply across the board, and we need to look at those other types of fees that we can charge, and we need to make that one of our recommendations going forward, that we need to, the impact fee process takes a while, because I think, Andy, you have to do a study, correct? So that you're not just charging a wildly,
you're gonna have to study your existing infrastructure, because we have a new treatment plant, but that doesn't mean anything if the pipe isn't big enough to get it there.
Right.
That sort of thing.
And to me, impact fees are more than just sewage.
Right.
I mean, they're sidewalks, they're bike paths, they're transit, they're you know, it's every impact that the development has. And it just blows my mind that a student housing development it doesn't clearly have an exponentially greater impact on a community than single family housing, right? So
David's right. There are other types of fees out there that we don't have. That could address some of those issues.
And we have police, and our current impact fees have police and fire. They have a parks and rec component, and they have the water and sewer infrastructure, right, Andy?
Yeah, that's about it.
But we can, you know, and I think that's what we need to say. We need to study our current base level impact fees as they currently exist, have those, you know, let's get those to the right level. And then let's think about the other types of fees that we charge for, you know, higher density, purpose-built student housing, whatever other zoning classifications, to be sure that we are taking advantage of those opportunities as they currently exist and truly reflect the impacts and needs that you know, other types of development have on the community, if that makes sense. So we are at 9:30, or 9:27. I will not be here next week. I'm out of town next week, but don't let that stop you all from meeting and maybe having this discussion about, I do get, and I understand, I like where David's going with this idea. How do we balance this idea of the zoning regulations being the blunt instrument that are going to have unintended consequences and aren't going to get us, you know, where we want to be, and the other alternatives and options on how we frame this and where we go. I'd like that discussion to begin at you know, hopefully sooner rather than later. In addition to further considerations about what a purpose-built student housing zoning classification would look like as well. So with that, let's make those the two agenda items, barring anything new coming up for next week's meeting. continue to think about the purpose-built student housing regulations, additional things that you think we need to consider there, including character form and other issues, and then thinking from a water tower view, how we do development in Clemson better. So with that, David had his hand up, then Elaine.
My comment was just a few housekeeping things. It seems like we make progress when we have something written down, someone takes the initiative to draft up something, we can then edit it and move forward and act on it. Secondly, I'm noticing that the Google Drive could benefit from some file management and classification modes, because it's impossible for me to find anything in there. So, you know, I think we need to create some filing protocols, some subfolders, and stuff like that. It'd be great to download some of these links that we have and actually have the documents available to us to go in and highlight and edit and copy from and stuff like that. So it'd be great to do those two things housekeeping wise.
So those are two great suggestions, David. The second one, we'll have Shannon can take a look at that, and Shannon, you and I can talk about a little bit of the organizational structure, because again, it's one of those things as we keep dumping things in, we need to continue the levels of how we organize those. So we'll work on that. And the first suggestion that's excellent as well, with that idea of the other form-based things, I'm going to ask you if you would be willing to kind of draft up your thoughts about how we do this outside of the blunt instrument of simple zoning regulations as well, and you know, so we can give us some direction on how that might look to get us started. That would be awesome.
Well, okay, but I am on vacation right now, traveling.
Okay.
So you're gonna have to give me a couple weeks to get to that.
Okay, and actually, I'd appreciate, because you know, again, with me missing the meeting next week, I do want to be a part of that discussion as well. So yeah, if we could, let's put that for 2 weeks from now. David will get us something, just a little guide and maybe some initial thoughts to begin that conversation for our meeting in 2 weeks. Next week, let's I'm sure some other things may come up that we need to address. But next week, let's make the goal with me not here to be moving the needle further on the purpose-built student housing regulations and beginning to put some form to what we might move forward as a recommendation. And Elaine also had her hand up.
I've just shared with Shannon some definitions I found in a couple of sites. One was a Forbes article, and then another website that it's more extensive definition of purpose-built student housing than just the bedroom description. And I'd like to see us maybe come to, if she would have that to share with us next week.
Okay.
And I don't think it'll take us long to decide what components we want in that definition, but I do think we need a very specific definition that works for the city of Clemson.
Okay.
I will do that, Elaine.
So Shannon, I think it would be helpful if we do that again, if you can add those links, plus you've added the links that Ken talked about, and give a little primer of, you may want to look at some, you know, when you go into the zoning regulations, look at some of the other, you know, zoning districts that they have and see if there's anything in there that might be applicable when you're talking about student housing as well. Because as it said, the Orem one, there's a number of things that we probably want to consider that are in additional zoning classifications there that would be pertinent to us with student housing in the 7.5 square mile land, lake, and university locked community that we're in, as opposed to Orem, Utah. So if y'all could do that, and if you could, you know, on that sheet, send that out as a direct email to the group so that it's easy to find those things and look at those and consider those as we move forward. But let's use the Orem student housing regulation as our baseline to plug into, add to, edit as appropriate and necessary. Make sense?
Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. I am going to ask, obviously Shannon and then, and Dr. McGuire to work together to lead the meeting next week in my absence. Let me know if you need anything in the meantime. Otherwise, for this purposes of this meeting, I will see you all in 2 weeks.
Mhm.
All right.
Thank you.
Unless I happen to not have a meeting at 8 to 9:30, next Wednesday morning. If I don't, I might try to hop on for at least the first part, if depending on when we get started that day. So,
Mhm.
all right. Thank you
Okay.
all very much. And I appreciate your time, and we'll see you in 2 weeks, and y'all see each other next
Mhm.
week.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Bob.
All right. Shannon, you want to stop recording and hang on for a